You're listening to GWP News Weekly. I'm your host, Isaac Hedges, and our top stories tonight we'll be looking at a recent security risk at Mar-a-Lago, Mahomes' budget cut, and Dilbert's demise. All that and much more coming up on GWP News Weekly. And in just a few moments, we will have the weather and sports segment with Jacob Bulmer. But in the meantime, we've got some news stories to get to, so hopefully we will be able to survive until then. Well, as many of you may have heard, there recently was a security threat at Mar-a-Lago, that being President Trump's resort again, and one of his residences at that in Florida recently was encountered with a security threat. Again, that would be the suspect in question, 21-year-old Austin Tucker Martin, attempted to enter Mar-a-Lago with a can of gasoline and a shotgun. Again, that is coming into one of the residences of, or attempting to come into one of the residences of the president. Of course, around the area. Around this time, there, of course, was a shooting. And again, luckily, not a great deal of harm was caused. Again, that we know of at this point. Of course, the president and first lady, fortunately, were not there. They were hosting the Governors Association dinner at the White House. So, again, quite concerning, as we've seen in recent times already, multiple attempts on the president's life, and it would appear that this would be another one, or at least an attempt to do so. And now, again, around this time, Martin's family, interestingly, posted a flyer on Facebook around 7 o'clock a.m. on February 22nd, which was 6 hours after the shooting had happened at Mar-a-Lago. And this flyer contained his name and photo, along with a plea for information about his whereabouts. Again, his mother, of course, did not respond or request comments, though she said she last heard from her son at around 7:51 p.m. on February 22nd. A spokesperson for Moore County Sheriff's Office in North Carolina, where Martin lived, said that the young man's relative reported him missing at 1:38 a.m. on February 22nd. So, again, still a little bit blurry on the details of when exactly this happened, but these, again, are the tips coming into the sheriff's office in the area as to what we know. Again, that's some of the best information we have up to this point as to when exactly some of this may have went down. But again, his relatives reported that he had gone missing at 1:38 a.m. on February 22nd. Now, after the fact, we know that he attempted to, and he did enter, of course, Mar-a-Lago near its north gate. Again, this is according to Palm Beach County Sheriff Rick Bradshaw. He entered the property near its north gate there and was confronted by two Secret Service agents and a deputy. He was ordered to drop his weapons. He put down the gas can, but raised the shotgun to a shooting position. Again, this is according to the Palm Beach County Sheriff Rick Bradshaw. So, again, an active threat, potentially even relating to national security. Again, that sort of is what is implied here. National Land Association, this being one of the residences of the President of the United States. And again, this fellow was an active threat. Again, the Secret Service agents attempted to de-escalate the threat. And again, he dropped his gas can, but raised his shotgun to a shooting position. So posed an active threat naturally. And again, unfortunate that it led to us. But again, being the active threat that this fellow was, he was taken out promptly by Secret Service. Now again, naturally, it is unfortunate, very sad that it all led to this. Again, the suspect in question, now deceased. Very unfortunate for his family, but again, is what it would seem was warranted as he posed an active threat at that point when confronted by the Secret Service agents at Mar-a-Lago. Now, in other recent events, we've seen the Kansas City Chiefs making some cuts relating to their quarterback, Patrick Mahomes. Now, the Chiefs recently restructured Patrick Mahomes' contract for fourth consecutive year and converted his $54.45 million 2026 salary into a signing bonus. Now, has lowered his cap hit, that is, from $78.2 million to $34.65 million. So, a bit of a cut to Mahomes' salary, and it cleared up $43.65 million in space. Kansas City remains about $11 million over the $303 million cap for expenses in that department. This move delays their financial strain and adds about $11 million annually to Mahomes' cap from 2027 to 2031, with an $85 million hit looming in the season ahead. And now, again, this is following an unfortunate season from the Kansas City Chiefs. Of course, as compared to years past, the Chiefs, years before this past year, that is, the Chiefs had, again, quite decent performance, appearing in multiple Super Bowls, but again, this past year, didn't perform nearly up to those levels. And again, on top of all of that, as we've mentioned repeatedly here on GWP News Weekly, on the Great World Podcast, all across Great World Productions, and again, something that's likely on the minds of many of our viewers and listeners out there, is that the Kansas City Chiefs are, of course, moving out of Missouri. Missouri, of course, has the historical claim to the city of Kansas City, which predates the state of Kansas, but Kansas is willing to offer more funding in terms of what they're willing to give, what they're willing to introduce in terms of taxes in the state to contribute to the construction of the new stadium. So again, unfortunately, it would appear that Arrowhead, that is coming up in 2031, will soon be abandoned. So just one of the major hits, and now we've seen some comments from some of the players for the Chiefs, from again some of the top players, Mahomes, Travis Kelce, notably, again, one of them mentioning that this was heartbreaking moving away from Arrowhead, and certainly we can see why as Missourians here. So, again, just things not looking well for the Kansas City Chiefs at this point. Very unfortunate, looking at budget cuts on that front as we head into the next season. Again, very unfortunate. Hopefully they'll be able to recover some of that on their performance. So again, there are naysayers. Things aren't looking too good, as of course they are moving to the dark side now, moving over to Kansas. So again, in terms of the Chiefs' performance, one can certainly hope, but again, the trends over the course of the past year are not great. So again, we'll continue to cover that again in the coming NFL season here on GWP News Weekly, primarily, of course, in our sports segment, of course, which is featured in every edition of GWP News Weekly. And we will have our sports segment this week, of course, just in a few moments with co-host Jacob Fulmer. Now, again, that is about the extent of recent developments with the Kansas City Chiefs in the area. In other recent events, we've seen something which we teased at a little bit in a GWP Weekly Recap this past week, and something that we covered perhaps in the weekly recap and earlier editions, certainly on GWP News Weekly. Well, tragically, the cartoonist of the famous comic strip, Dilbert, Scott Adams, passed away. Now, again, we talked about some of that. One thing that we referenced on that front on GWP News Weekly with Scott Adams, of course, leading up to his death, again, not all that long before it, he was considering, of course, he lived in the state of California, which has legal euthanasia, again, which meant call assisted suicide, again. So, an unfortunate, again, being in that position, considering making that decision, again, we believe that that is never the right option, and he came very close, had already purchased the medications to go through with it, and ended up deciding instead, and thank goodness he did, because he was able to live for a few months, and a year after considering, again, taking his own life by these means. So very fortunate on that front, but we knew that he likely wouldn't be around much longer because, unfortunately, he was battling with a very severe case of prostate cancer. So, again, things didn't last too much longer after that. Sadly, again, rest in peace, Scott Adams. But since his death, we've seen some recent developments, and this is relating to remarks that he made during his lifetime. Of course, in addition to his comic strip, again, a comic strip appeared in many newspapers across the country and had an important cultural influence. It was very significant on that front, and beyond his comic strip, he often took part in interviews relating to his work and different things, contributed to a number of podcasts. And well, one of the things he said on a podcast at one point, again, one of his one of his last interviews in a podcast, he mentioned that he would like to see people after his passing set up an AI version of himself. Again, sort of using a database sort of based on the things that he said during his lifetime. Again, that would sort of generate these videos of him, again, similar to the ones that he did in his lifetime, where he said new things that were sort of just in the same spirit of things he said during his lifetime that were sort of trained on an AI model and used as a database, things that he said during his lifetime. Well, now after his passing, unsurprisingly, people have been doing just that. They've set up an AI version of Scott Adams on the internet. Again, this takes the form oftentimes of videos of him, again, somewhat convincing resemblance using his likeness, his photographs, and different things from his actual appearances, presumably on podcasts, television, different things like that. But again, this of course is not him, and some may think this somewhat resembles a deepfake, and certainly it does. We've talked about deepfakes and AI extensively across GWP News Weekly and the Great World Podcast. That's been one of our key topics from the very inception of our first venture, the Great World Podcast. And naturally, we continue to cover major events relating to artificial intelligence, having the major influence that it does this day and age. Well, certainly that was a prevalent topic. Certainly, towards the end there of Scott Adams' life, he was discussing. Now, some may say that these recent iterations, these AI iterations of him, of Scott Adams, resemble a deepfake somewhat, and certainly they do. Again, they are an imitation of him. They do maintain that element that we see in deepfakes, an imitation of the actual person. But again, generally, the case with deepfakes is that, or AI deepfakes, is that they are an imitation of an actual living person. And again, we've seen that. We've seen lawsuits relating to that in recent times with different actors, different actresses, notably. And so it's not difficult to reference these instances of deepfakes and say, oh, this thing happening with Scott Adams, well, this is a deepfake. Well, it certainly is an imitation of him, though it isn't exactly a deepfake in so much as he is no longer alive. Now, again, many, based on his comments during his life, he said multiple times on the record that he would like to see an AI version of himself operated after his passing to sort of contribute in the way that he did to cultural discourse and discussions on different prevalent topics. So again, one wouldn't be blamed for assuming that this is just fine, that this is exactly what he wanted. But we have received some conflicting information on that. Now, Adam's family has made comment on these AI imitations of him, and they've suggested that the people running these AI versions of Scott Adams in question weren't actually authorized to do it. They did not have permission for it. And again, the family has advised them to stop doing this, again, because they have not received proper permissions for it. So, again, a very interesting developing story relating to artificial intelligence. So, again, one of our key topics from the very inception of the Great World Podcast, the very first venture here at Great World Productions. Now, this, of course, is GWP News Weekly, but again, we periodically post episodes of the Great World Podcast still, so you can check out all of that and more on the Great World Productions YouTube channel and across our different platforms. Again, among other things, of course, one of our recent series being GWP What in the World. Again, a number of other great offerings from Great World Productions and a number of other things coming your way throughout the year. So you'll want to stay tuned for all of that. Now, an important distinction to make on this front, again, with the family of Scott Adams suggesting that the people with these AI versions of Scott Adams are unauthorized to do so. Well, there is a distinction to be made between consent and contract. Now, again, when Scott Adams went on the record during his lifetime multiple times and he suggested that he would like for people to run an AI version of him after his passing, again, that was sort of consent, you could say, sort of in the looser sense. He was, in a sense, recommending people. One could argue giving them permission to operate this artificial intelligence version of him after his death. And we know that at least that part of his request was honored, at least that part of his intention that he did specify after his death. Again, this wasn't done necessarily until after his tragic passing. But again, there still is a distinction to be made between consent and a contract. So he may have loosely advised them to do this on the record at different times and may have suggested it, recommended, again, even loosely given them permission to. But again, in terms of formal agreements, in terms of actual contracts, the family has now come out and said that a contract for this arrangement hadn't been established. So there is an ongoing debate on this, which is very prevalent, not just to Scott Adams, again, not to take away from this particular situation, but again, we've seen a number of questions raised in recent times relating to AI as it becomes more prevalent in the workforce. Many are calling this the AI revolution, how it's going to influence our jobs, how it's going to influence the workforce, and we've seen this particularly across Hollywood with the threat of deepfakes, which we mentioned previously, and this again somewhat resembles that, and certainly this is the first time we're hearing of instances like this, but it likely won't be the last as these technologies are rapidly developing. And again, because that is such an important question, as we mentioned, that is going to be our GWP question of the week. It will be relating to that. Again, throughout the week, you will be able to find that question posted on our YouTube channel, of course, that question in full. But that question, generally speaking, is going to be relating to, of course, in terms of specific current events. It will relate to the situation with Scott Adams, of course, who passed recently, with these people on the internet attempting to run AI versions of him, and whether they should be able to do that or not without explicit agreement with his family. Again, there's an argument to be made for both, because on one hand, of course, he suggested that he would like to see people do that multiple times on the record, on interviews during his lifetime. On the other hand, perhaps we ought to honor the wishes of his family, again, make some actual agreement with them in terms of these operations, and sort of honor the grieving family's wishes. So again, we'd like to hear what all of our listeners, viewers out there think on this. You think they ought to be able to do that? Yes or no? And speaking more broadly about the implications, the whole notion of AI afterlives, again, up to this point, it's been largely unheard of, the notion of it in practice, though it hasn't been entirely heard of in principle. We've seen this introduced again some time ago in science fiction. Of course, a concept that we've heard discussed recently that we've covered briefly is the metaverse, which of course is a concept that takes its origins from science fiction, and now, as we know, is actually a venture of a company by the same name, or by part of the name, of course, Meta, who owns Facebook, who owns Instagram. Again, one of their ventures is called the Metaverse, which deals in virtual reality. Presumably now they're dabbling in artificial intelligence as well. But again, in the very works of literature, of science fiction that introduced, that coined the term metaverse. Again, interestingly, these dystopian works that coined the term metaverse, again, fictional universe in which the actual one in which we live has again fallen into disrepair and become almost inhabitable, that requires us to again resort to a virtual alternative to the universe. Again, this is where the term metaverse takes its origins, and interestingly, that term specifically, again, knowing the origins of it, again, referencing the book Pastimes of the Record by, of course, Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of parent company Meta, with the metaverse, again, shows that name from a dystopian work. So, again, very interesting observation on that front. But, again, from such works as that, again, sort of a prevalent concept in science fiction, again, relating to futurism and predictions as to what will happen with technology down the line. Well, this has been a common point of discussion. Again, it's been suggested in the past, again, accepted to varying degrees. So, again, for some time, it's understandably been seen as somewhat far-fetched, though, the notion that when we pass away, that we'll somehow be able to be uploaded to the metaverse. Again, sort of attempting at sort of immortality. Again, immortality is something ordinarily that isn't meant for humans. Again, this is a recurrent discussion as well. Again, sort of adjacent to the whole AI discussion, certainly to the whole notion of AI afterlives, and again, to the metaverse, the whole notion of that as a whole. Well, one of the things we've discussed on the Great World podcast in past episodes is the notion of attempting to usurp human bounds. Again, in terms of attempting with these advances, again, at what point have you gone too far? At what point are you usurping natural bounds, attempting to play attempting to play God that is doing things that we shouldn't necessarily be doing? Is this that? It's possible. Again, let us know what you think in the GWP question of the week coming your way this coming week here from Great World Productions. Again, something that we'll revisit. You'll have the week to answer that question. Again, do you think Scott Adams' family ought to, or no, do you think people ought to be able to operate this AI version of Scott Adams' family in spite of his family's wishes? And again, I'd like to elaborate more to the broader question of AI afterlives. We certainly can touch on that as well, and we'll revisit it throughout the week. Again, this coming week on our GWP weekly recap. So again, one of the many great things you'll want to stay tuned for coming your way this week from Great World Productions. So, again, in terms of that on the Great World Podcast, that has been a common recurring discussion. Of course, about when exactly do we go too far in these advances? When we planning? When does it begin to harm people? Different questions like that. So just a few things to consider, a few adjacent questions when answering your GWP question of the week, and we'd love to hear from our viewers, listeners out there on that. Whatever you might have to think, whatever you might have to contribute on that front, we would love to hear on that. You can contribute anything in the comments below this video. Again, if you want to reach out to us throughout the week, number one way of doing that is calling Great World Productions at 417-448-0819. Again, that number is 417-448-0819. Give us a call and let us know. We would love to hear what you've got to say. So, again, just a few things to consider on that front, and again, a few things to take into consideration when answering that question. And again, we will be heading momentarily into the weather and sports segments with Jacob Fulmer again, right about now. So, up next is weather with Jacob Fulmer.